All right, well, I guess that means we should get started, but I want to start by saying that everybody here, you should absolutely give yourselves a hand because it's 3 days into the conference, we're in Vegas, and you're still showing up to presentations. That is impressive. This is the group we really want to talk to. These are the diehards right here. My name is Rich Standleicher, and I'm the Chief Strategist at Veza, and we are a leading identity security company. We help organizations answer the question who can, who has, and who should take what action on what resource, really helping you get to least privilege. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this trend that we're starting to see within organizations and customers that we talk to around universal intelligent access policy, really answering that question of who should have access, but doing it in a way that's comprehensive across your entire IT infrastructure, grounding it in the reality of what's actually there today, but also doing it in a way that you have a progressive path to the future, that you don't have to do a re-architecture, you don't have to start with a big bang, you can get progress as you go. So joining me is the CISO of Wynn Resorts, David Taberski, and he's going to be telling you a little bit more about some of the real-world examples, his successes and challenges in actually implementing this at his organization. And we are planning to leave some time for questions at the end, but you know what they say, David, about the road to hell?
It's paved with good intentions, right?
They also say it's paved with well-planned out, timed conference speaking agendas. So we will see if we actually make it there.
It's a stairway to heaven and a highway to hell, so.
That's right, that's right. So given that we're here at Identiverse, I probably don't need to tell you a lot about why identity is important. But one of the things and the trends that I'm seeing lately is that people who don't necessarily have identity in their title are starting to understand. And that includes CISOs, CIOs, analysts, press, investors even. And I think it has something to do with the fact that these high-profile breaches, like Change Healthcare, like Microsoft, pick your favorite breach, and some of the things that have happened to organizations right close to where we are here, and the profile that identity and the role that identity has played in those breaches. It's really raising the bar, raising the visibility of how critical identity is for security. And if you look at the tool sets that organizations have, including all these organizations that suffered these types of breaches in the traditional identity senses of the word, they've had tools in PAM, they've had tools in IAM, they've had tools in IGA, oftentimes they have multiple tools in each. And yet, when you still go down a deeper level to a more fundamental functional level, and you ask them, well, do you know who has access to do what? And they say, sort of, because most organizations know what apps a user have, and they know what groups that someone's a member of, and maybe even they understand the roles that a user can access. But when you go down and ask the question like, well, do you understand who has delete privileges on your most critical table of customer data? Usually the answer is, that takes a lot of work, right? It's usually a lot of manual process, a lot of investigation, or a lot of custom scripting. It's not something that's readily available. And so the question is, does it matter? And I would say, well, are you trying to get to least privilege? If you are, I'd say you don't really know if you are. If you can't answer this question, I think this is actually the heart of getting to least privilege. But let's set aside the question of visibility for a minute, and let's go and look at it from the operational perspective, in terms of like, what are the processes that are really going on here? And there are 4 key ones around gaining and removing permissions that I typically see at organizations. The first is around birthright provisioning, joiner, mover, leaver, right? And where you're actually getting these things, typically those are governed by groups. And you're going to groups in AD, in Azure AD, or Entra ID, or Okta, or whatever you have. But the question is, do the people who are running these processes really understand how the nested groups work within them? Sometimes. The second, you've got a request process, where an employee goes to a request portal, and it's backed by IT operations and an enterprise workflow process. Again, that works, but does the employee who's asking for access always understand which group or role to ask for? Does the IT operations person really know what to grant to get them the thing that they need, but conform to least privilege? It's pretty hard. The third process is one I like to call shadow provisioning, right? This is the stuff that happens and should never happen, right? Usually this is local users and ACL level permissions on the individual system. Sometimes it's developers getting service accounts on these core systems, but it's the thing that everybody knows should never happen, but always does. And the visibility is almost never there, especially for the security teams. And finally, you have the access review and removal process, right? So there is absolutely a process at most organizations, but when you ask about, well, does it really do what it's supposed to do? How many times do permissions actually get removed in this process? And the answer I've heard again and again is almost never, almost zero. And so you look at all these processes that usually live in their own silos, you say, what's the net result of all this? And really, it's that all these processes kind of ought to work, but essentially they're rubber stamping. A lot of these things are done for compliance. A lot of these things are done, but not really getting to that final goal of least privilege. And so what happens if we take a clean look at the problem and really look at like where are we trying to get to with least privilege? And there are really three legs of the stool that can be expressed in the core question of who can, who has, and who should take what action and what data. So first, when you look at the can, this is permissions as they really exist today. Then you have the who has. Usually that goes to activity, right? To actually see who's been accessing these things, who's been using their permissions. And that's close, but what you really want to get to is business need. Activity and business need are the closest things. They work pretty well, but there's some key exceptions that we'll talk about. They don't always work. The last is policy. This is the should, right? And this is often the hardest piece because a lot of times you can say who should in a very high level theoretical way, but it has to get practical. You have to be able to implement it on all these different systems that you're touching to really make it useful, to really get to that ideal of least privilege. So putting all these things together, now at the center of that, that's really where you want to get to. That is the core and the heart of least privilege. And so if we look in a little bit more to each of these pillars, the first is who can take action. Typically, again, this is divided up into, when you talk about identity, we're at an identity conference, it's usually in the world of users and groups, right? But to really get to the heart of the matter, you've got to go deeper. In a cloud platform, this might be going into the craziness of AWS IAM or Azure RBAC and trying to decompose that and really understand what's there. But you can't even stop there because you have to go into the key services themselves. In the case of AWS, you have to go into Redshift, you have to go into S3. If you're going into Snowflake, you've got to go deep into those systems to pull out all the different resources that are in there to know what you're tying to, but also to get to things like local users, to get to ACL level permissions, right? That is the key, and those are often the things that are highly privileged and invisible to all your other processes. It's very easy to do all this stuff and just say, well, I'm just going to worry about the IDP. I'm just going to worry about the things I can SSO into, and the rest is, well, I can't get there, so I'm not going to look. But the challenge is, this is where the security risks reside. And you have to do it not just on cloud platforms, but you have to do it on structured data systems, like databases. You have to do it on unstructured data systems, like SharePoint Online, data lakes like Snowflake, SaaS applications, custom applications you built in-house, on-premise applications, everything. The second pillar is the has. As we talked about it, this is activity, which is pretty good. But there are some key gaps here where activity does not map to true business need. Examples here would be overuse of data training on LLMs, break glass permissions, insider threat scenarios, right? So you have to be a little careful here because you're not going to get perfect alignment between activity and true business need. You want to look a little closer. I was actually talking to a customer who said that they had a system where they had admin level permissions set up to expire if someone didn't use it in 90 days. Great idea. But what they found, an interesting pattern of behavior, was a lot of users wouldn't use it. Then on day 70, maybe day 80, they would come, log in, log right back off. Right? Users do not want to give up their privileges. You don't have a lot of people raising their hand and saying, I can do too many things. Right? It just doesn't happen. You have to get smarter. And finally, this is probably the most challenging of the pillars, the should. As we talked about, the devil is really in the details here. Because you can't just do it at the high level. You have to get more granular. You have to make it practical and implementable to really make a difference. Right? And so when you're thinking about all these things, and where oftentimes it's left to a manager inside an enterprise workflow process to make decisions. Right? That's where the key and the rubber hits the road. But these managers may not have the right context. They might not have the right information about when they grant someone access to a group. What does that imply about the data access? What about the business risk? Do they really understand what that means to grant that data access to this person in terms of the needs of the business? Do they even understand the policy? Do you even have the framework in your policy to tell them what should be true, to tell them what is the case? It's often hard. These things don't exist. When you think about most policies, they're typically binary. Do you give access or not? But thinking a little more deeply about it, and perhaps even more importantly, is not only do you give access, but when do you take access away? You know, how long should this person have access? Should it be for persistent, even through employment, because there's something around employment law that requires it? Should it be while they're actively accessing it in the last 90 days they keep access? Maybe they should only get access for an hour because it's a production system. Maybe they should never get access because that is forbidden for that employee ever to touch that data. Right? So thinking about it more broadly, now things like JIT access, that becomes a sub-policy that exists in this system. Right? It becomes a condition where you really need to comprehensively look at not just when you grant access, but when do you take it away. That has to be part of this overall policy system. And so now you think about pulling this all together. And so our customers tell us that when they're looking at tools, they really want to invest in a modern platform that can cover all systems, everything, everyone, human identities, non-human identities, that has the ability to see beyond groups and roles into downstream permissions, that has the ability to really standardize so that business users can see and understand what's really going on, and that's automatable, that you can go from continuous monitoring to continuous remediation, even to then driving and configuring their environment automatically. So this is what we mean when we say intelligent access. It's its vision of bringing this all together. But of course, you have to start somewhere, right? And so it has to be grounded in reality. You don't want to have to do a big re-architecture. You want to be able to make progress over time. So when we think about this problem, it really is starting at step one, starting at visibility. Understand what you have. That's how you begin. Once you understand what you have, then you can move to start fixing the most critical issues that come up. But that's how you generate wins. That's how you make progress. That's how you get and actually sell it throughout the organization. Once you've started to do that process, you can move to the final stage of control. Now you actually are smart enough about what the policies ought to be so you can start to write them, so you can start to get it right on day one as opposed to always chasing your tail and try to catch up, which is a never-ending task. So with that, thinking about how we actually implement this in the real world, I think it's a great time to go into our second part of our presentation. I'll hand it over to David.
You haven't. Well, if you hit that button, you're going to have my big picture up there.
Yes,
what is that?
Let's do that.
Or not. One of the two.
There it is.
So one of the things Rich just said is about how we orchestrate identity to begin with, right? How do we get from you've hired somebody to you've granted access, but you as the identity professional need to know, do they have the correct stuff? So that is a key component. But how many people stay in the job that they stay in forever in the organization? They migrate from one to another, right? And all of a sudden, they've been through 4 different positions, and you're looking down at their permission set, and you're going, oh my God, they still have the same permissions they did from 4 jobs ago, and the one they had 3 jobs ago, and 2 jobs ago, and so forth and so on, right? And so when you think about how you're orchestrating people, it's not just about how you birthright them, but it's how you progress them through the organization from position to position, and then how you actually get them to, out of the organization when they decide to win the lottery and, leave. I don't talk about getting hit by a bus. I try to be positive. But so the idea is to be able to see that and how you do that. So how did we do that at Wynn? So We have, of course, our HR platform, which is the source of truth of all of our human identity, right? Who do we have hired? And we have, just like probably all of you, and IDP, we actually have 3 of them, unfortunately. So we had to integrate between our HR platform and our IDPs so that we can drive that data. Then we said, okay, we need a way to pretty much orchestrate that. So we brought ServiceNow into play and put an orchestration platform through ticketing on top of that. And then we said, oh my God, we've got all of this working, and we've now got some automations functioning. And we said, what have we just done? We have just created this massive way to move, but we still didn't have good visibility. And so we said, now we need to look backwards at it and say, we've got a good front end to get us to do a bunch of stuff and hide away all these local identities. But now we have to have some visibility on the back end to say, what did we just do? So understanding that the absolute source of truth to any permission set or any role is the application itself. Doesn't matter how you got there. That's where the permission lives. So we needed to orchestrate that. Veza came in to help us do that and say, okay, now we can start collecting from all of these applications from the cloud, from on-premise, from everywhere, and get a true picture of any one of our people. So we have a good orchestration in the front end, we have good authorization and authentication in the middle, and then we have good attestation on the back. How many of you still do attestation reviews? Like quarterly? Do you? I haven't done one in 4 years, by the way, because we flipped it on its head. We flipped it to the front to say, I don't need to do that up front, because if I organize by role, I can say these roles have these authorities, and you are entitled to take that as you move into that role. We can take them away as you move out of the role, and then we have a good platform to monitor it and to know whether or not that was done, both through human and non-human identity through this platform. So it's been an interesting journey on what we've learned along the way, especially when we're dealing with, right now, about 17,000 employees, 420 applications, roughly 25 roles per application, and some of them are just ridiculous in the number of permissions per role. The other question I like to ask people when I'm talking about this, a simple example: how many people do you think in your organization have the power to issue a purchase order and pay a purchase order? Seems like they shouldn't be able to do that, right? How many of them are the exact same system? They're not. Not in our organization. Nobody I've ever talked to said, oh yeah, it's right within, our accounting platform, right? Purchase orders are run through a purchasing platform, paying them are through an accounting platform, and nobody has any idea of who has the same permission in both sides, because it's hard to find it. The goal, the ultimate goal, I don't know if you have that slide, but that doesn't matter. The ultimate goal we were looking at was take our audit team and take everything they do, which they do quarterly and sometimes monthly. And how many people love their audit teams? Nobody? Really? I love my audit team. They can be leveraged to your benefit. But what if you could take all of their work and do it every 24 hours? Right? Everybody know what bear theory is? Right? I don't have to outrun the bear, I only have to outrun you. Right? So the idea was, take the audit team, take every bit of work that they do monthly, quarterly, and annually, and automate it so that it runs every 24 hours, every day. And by the time they get to do their official work and they deal with the externals and they do all of that, they never find anything. So what do? They go off and make it even harder, and we automate that. And to a point, after about a 2-year stint, they're off dealing with the accounting people, and they're off looking at everybody else, because they're not looking at us for identities anymore, because they never find anything. Mostly because I can find it and fix it faster than they can ever see it. That's the way to do it. Then your audit team leaves you alone. Yes, they can be leveraged, I will give you that, but it's more fun to just walk by and they go, who's that? Right? So with that, what questions can I answer? That's more important than me just up here blathering. Yes, sir.
I would love to hear how you guys leverage the audit team. And I'm assuming that that's related back to identity in some way or potentially.
So,
Curiosity, because quite frankly, I don't want to say I've always seen them as the enemy, but come on, man. Like they show up and they're like,
I'll give you.
"You've got 3 months, and if you don't, we're coming after you."
I will give you an exact example of that. As I said, I flipped my the quarterly attestations on their head. Oh, apparently I have 5. I would have preferred a 10, but that's fine. I was literally in a board meeting with the audit committee, and at the time I didn't have any of this done. This was about 10 years ago, and the audit team was in the room, and I had 1,800 findings that we were talking about with the audit committee. Needless to say, I wasn't really sitting well, not for that day or about a week after. But by listening to what they were yelling about, listening to what they were pushing to the audit committee, I realized that attestation process is at the wrong time, which is why we flipped it. Because what happens is somebody gets access. They have the access for 2 months, 3 months, whatever. The audit finds it, and somebody says, oh, they shouldn't have had it, so now you go take it away. But what does the audit team do? Well, what did they do with it? Did they use it? Did they do something wrong? Did they have access to data that they shouldn't have had access to? And so you have all these questions to answer. So I said, well, instead of doing it at the end, let's put it at the beginning and stop that from ever happening in the first place. And so by flipping it around and doing that, now instead of having to do an attestation, we do a validity check against what they've already approved to be acceptable. So we're not going out and asking the manager, is this okay? That's already pre-approved based on role. All we have to do is say, was this person put into anything that they weren't supposed to be, right? And now when we built the orchestration platform, it'll prevent that anyway. So we built it up front. But that's how I leverage. That's the specifics of how I leveraged it. By the way, the very next time I was in my audit committee, I went from 1,800 to 4. To which the CTO looked at me and went, okay, now you got to tell me how you did that. Yes?
What do you use for your orchestration platform?
Currently, it's on ServiceNow. It's a custom-built application on ServiceNow. At one point, we did actually put it on the ServiceNow cloud, but it's been pulled down. We spent a little too much money, and the company went, we're not giving that away. But I'd be happy to show it to you if you're ever really interested.
Can you talk more about the automation?
So, sure. At Wynn, in the last year, there have been 0 Active Directory accounts created by hand. I will tell you that. It's 100% fully automated. Of the 435 applications that I'm currently tracking in our automation, 72% are fully automated for access provisioning, which includes the removal as people move from position to position and down. A lot of that was done in PowerShell. A lot of it was done with RPA processes. There seems to be a fair number of applications out there when you try to put them in the back end, like shove identities in the database behind the scenes. The manufacturers get really upset about that. So we had to build through the systems with RPA and functionality like that. But it has taken a good 2 years, I will tell you that, to get to that point. And it's been app by app. Yes, sir.
Do you have, you mentioned there's a scheduled job running every 24 hours. So do you have a scheduled task for against each application to detect the violation and leveraging your Snow for orchestration to do the total remediation?
Yes. Yes, and not only, well, that's the 24-hour audit check. The actual checks for the automation occur every hour. So by the time you get terminated, from Wynn, if you were terminated, within 2 hours of your termination out of the HR platform, your entire access is gone.
Just one more question. Veza providing direct write-up.
Speaking of that, I'm going to check my access just to make sure. No, I'm kidding. Yes, go ahead.
We have a customer at a similar need, so that's what I'm asking. Veza providing the
Yes.
when you detect a violation, do you, let's say if you get 3 users getting violation, do you send in one single request to Snow, or do you have a 3 separate distinct?
One request. It's the same queue that my identity and access team work out of, and then all the automation triggers from there as well. So the idea behind it was if the automation triggers, then it clears that ticket automatically out of Snow. But if it fails or has a problem or whatever, which we document into the ticket, then the identity team can go right there and see the same data.
For your custom map, are you using OAA or using some sort of
Yes, I am using OAA in a lot of things. That's a fun story, right, Rich?
Indeed.
Yes. I will tell you, a lot of the functionality of OAA was built for me by Veza because I was standing on them to do that.
That's right.
Yes.
So I think, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'll be around afterwards, and David,
You gotta
probably
get more-
can spend a
you gotta
little
get
bit
more
more time. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and I'm
thanks
here
for-
if you need
thanks for
anything.
coming.
So.